May 18, 1539. The shallow bay of Tampa Bay, Florida. The smell of salt and decay hangs heavy in the humid air. The water, a deceptive turquoise, laps against the hulls of 9 Spanish ships anchored just offshore. On the white sand beach, a spectacle of steel and piety unfolds. A force of over 600 conquistadors, clad in rusting armor and sun-faded velvets, kneels in the sand. Their leader, a seasoned and grim-faced veteran named Hernando de Soto, stands before a large, hand-carved wooden cross recently planted in the dunes. Priests chant in Latin, swinging censers that emit sweet-smelling smoke, a futile attempt to mask the scent of sweat, fear, and ambition. The clank of armor mixes with the prayers as the men take communion, preparing their souls for conquest. But they are not alone. From the dense, impossibly green wall of palmettos, sawgrass, and twisted live oaks, unseen eyes watch. The Timucua and Tacabaga peoples observe these strange, pale men encased in metal, these bearded ones who arrived in floating castles. They see the war horses, monstrous, snorting creatures the likes of which no Floridian had ever witnessed. They note the glint of the arquebuses, the primitive firearms whose thunder would soon echo through these quiet wetlands. De Soto's mission, sanctioned by the Spanish crown, is not exploration. It is entrada, an armed invasion. He carries chains for slaves, war dogs trained to tear flesh, and a singular obsessive dream to find another empire like the Aztecs, to plunder its gold and to claim this land for God and King. The prayer ends. The cross stands as a stark, foreign silhouette against the Florida sky. De Soto gives a quiet order. The ranks rise, a thunderous sound of scraping metal. Soldiers shoulder their heavy packs, containing everything from nails to disease. They form a column. With a crack of a whip and the shouted command of cavalrymen, the first war horses are driven off the ships, splashing into the warm coastal waters, their hooves finding purchase on the continent. The march begins not into a wilderness, but into a complex, ancient network of sophisticated native societies. De Soto and his men believe they are bringing civilization. In truth, they are bringing the apocalypse. The first steps onto the sand mark the beginning of a violent, 4-year odyssey of disease, massacre, and enslavement that will leave a trail of bones and emptied villages from one coast of Florida to the other. A dark founding chapter written not in ink, but in blood and fire. November 25, 1702. The view from the muddy Spanish parapets of Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine is one of smoke and looming violence. The coquina stone walls, made of compacted seashells that absorb cannon fire rather than shatter, are the only thing standing between the oldest permanent European settlement in what is now the United States and utter annihilation. Governor José de Zúñiga y La Cerda squints through the acrid haze. Surrounding the fort, stretching across the marshy fields and sandy dunes, are the tents and siege lines of an English Caribbean force from the colony of Carolina, led by Governor James Moore. But Moore's soldiers are only half his army. The other more terrifying half are his allies, hundreds of Yamasee and Creek warriors, armed with English muskets and a deep, generational hatred for the Spanish and their allied tribes. For over a century, Florida has been a fractured, bloody prize. The Spanish vision of a mission system, a chain of religious outposts meant to convert and pacify the native populations, has become a network of forced labor and cultural eradication. Now the English from the north offer guns, trade goods, and a promise. Help us erase the Spanish from the map, and you can reclaim your land and take Spanish slaves. It is a devil's bargain that turns Florida into a continental war zone. The siege is not just England versus Spain. It is a brutal proxy war, a Native American revolution fueled by vengeance. Inside the fortress, over 1,500 Spanish soldiers, settlers, and Timucuan and Apalachee refugees are packed together. The air is thick with the stench of fear, gunpowder, and unburied waste. English mortar shells arc over the walls, exploding in the central plaza. But the coquina holds. For weeks, the siege grinds on. Moore's native allies raid and burn the outlying mission villages, La Florida's supposed heartland, systematically undoing a century of Spanish work. They return to the English lines with Spanish slaves and Catholic relics as trophies. Finally, with his ammunition running low and a Spanish fleet feared to be on the way, Moore orders a desperate, all-out assault. In the pre-dawn chill, English grenadiers and Yamasee warriors charge the fortress walls. Muskets flash in the darkness. The Spanish defenders, waiting behind their absorbent stone ramparts, unleash a volley of grape shot and boiling water. The assault collapses in a tangle of screaming men. Moore retreats, but his campaign is a strategic victory. He has failed to take the castle, but he has utterly destroyed the Spanish mission system across northern Florida. The tribes allied with Spain are decimated, enslaved, or scattered. Florida is no longer a prosperous colony of conversion. It is a hollow, militarized shell, a lonely fortress guarding a depopulated wilderness. The peninsula's future has been decided not by European crowns, but by the complex, tragic alliances and rebellions of its original inhabitants. January 25, 1836. A sharp, freezing wind cuts across the sawgrass prairies of the Great Wahoo Swamp, south of present-day Gainesville. It is a damp, penetrating cold, alien to the subtropical land. A mixed force of over 250 U.S. Army regulars and Alabama volunteer militia, their blue and homespun wool coats soaked from fording the chest-deep, icy waters of the Withlacoochee River, forms a ragged skirmish line. They are exhausted, hungry, and led by the aging General Edmund P. Gaines, who is desperately trying to corner an enemy that seems to be a phantom of the landscape itself. The air is silent, save for the sigh of the wind through the tall grass and the distant cry of a sandhill crane. Then from the dense hammock of cypress and oak ahead, a single rifle shot cracks. A U.S. soldier crumples into the tea-colored water. In an instant, the silence explodes. A volley of musket fire erupts from the tree line, not from a formed line, but from 100 concealed individual points. The Americans return fire, blasting shot into the shadows, but they have no visible target. From the left flank, a group of Seminole warriors, clad in patchwork tunics and plumed headdresses, materializes from the swamp, firing and melting back into the cover. With them are black Seminoles, Africans who had escaped slavery from Georgia and the Carolinas, finding sanctuary and forging powerful alliances with the native tribes. They are the best fighters in the Seminole coalition, experts in guerrilla tactics, fighting not just for land, but for their very freedom. This is the Second Seminole War, America's longest and costliest Indian conflict. It is not a war for territory in the abstract. It is a war to forcibly remove people from Florida to reservations out west, clearing the land for plantation slavery. The U.S. strategy is one of overwhelming force. The Seminole and Black Seminole strategy is one of existential defiance. They use the Florida terrain as a weapon, the impenetrable swamps, the trackless pine woods, the blistering heat of summer, and the unexpected frosts of winter. They attack plantations, liberating the enslaved, and vanish into the wetlands. The battle at the Wahoo Swamp is a stalemate, a bloody, chaotic brawl in the muck that ends with the Americans withdrawing, carrying their wounded. But it is a symbol of the entire, grueling 7-year conflict. The U.S. will deploy over 40,000 troops, spend the equivalent of billions today, and see over 1,500 soldiers die, mostly from disease. They will capture leaders through deception, like the famed Osceola under a flag of truce. Yet they will never achieve a definitive victory. When the war sputters to an inconclusive end, over 3,000 Seminoles and allies are forcibly deported to Oklahoma. But a few hundred, the most determined, simply fade deeper into the Everglades, refusing to surrender. They remain, a testament to a resistance so fierce it forced a growing world power to a grudging, exhausted standstill. Florida's landscape itself had become a fortress of liberty for the dispossessed. February 15, 1895. The air in the lavish Tampa Bay hotel ballroom is thick with cigar smoke and the scent of orange blossoms forced into bloom for the occasion. Henry B. Plant, a railroad and steamship magnate with the cool eyes of a card shark, surveys his kingdom. Outside the Moorish revival minarets of his $2.5 million Palace Hotel, his own private railroad line terminates, delivering America's Gilded Age elite directly to his port cotcher. But tonight, the talk isn't of luxury. It's of war. Plant sips brandy with a cluster of stern-faced men in military dress, not U.S. Army, but Cuban revolutionary generals in exile. Their leader, Jose Marti, is here too, giving a passionate whispered speech in a corner, raising funds for the final push to liberate Cuba from Spain. This is the untold economic engine of Florida's first great boom. While men like Henry Flagler build their fantasy worlds down the East Coast for wintering socialites, Henry Plant is building an empire of leverage on the Gulf. He understands that Florida's destiny isn't just as a playground, but as a launch pad. His railroads and steamships have turned the mosquito-infested village of Tampa into a strategic port. He is lobbying Washington relentlessly, arguing that when the inevitable war with Spain over Cuba comes, his city with his infrastructure must be the primary staging ground. Cut to June 1898. The war has come. Plant's prediction is reality. Tampa is a chaotic, sweltering cauldron of 30,000 U.S. troops. The streets are rivers of mud from constant rain. Saloons and brothels overflow. And through this chaos on Plant's exclusive rail line, a special train arrives. Aboard is the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders. Their second in command, a dynamic, bespectacled New Yorker named Theodore Roosevelt, strides into the Tampa Bay Hotel, barking orders and brimming with ambition. For weeks, the hotel's grand veranda becomes a stage for history, where strategy is plotted and political fortunes are made. The war is won quickly, a splendid little war that cements America as a global power. And the man who profits perhaps most splendidly is Henry Plant. The U.S. government paid him a fortune in transport fees. The publicity is incalculable. The world now sees Florida not as a diseased frontier, but as America's subtropical nexus of commerce and military might. In the war's aftermath, a flood of northern capital and curiosity descends. The land rush begins. But this boom, built on speculation and wartime expediency, is brittle. It sets a template Florida will see again and again. A powerful individual leveraging geopolitics and natural disaster to reshape the peninsula in their image, reaping astronomical profit, while the social and environmental costs are left for the future to pay. September 16, 1928. The pre-dawn sky over Lake Okeechobee is a bruised purple. In the migrant labor camps that cling to the southern shore of the Great Lake, hundreds of men, women, and children, most of them Black Bahamian and African-American farm workers, are stirring. The air is unnaturally still and heavy. For days, a monstrous hurricane has churned across the Caribbean, leaving death in its wake. Telegraph wires have gone silent. The old-timers look at the glassy, agitated water of the lake, which sits higher than the surrounding farmland, held back by a frail, 6-foot-tall mound of muck and sand the locals call a dike. They feel the pressure drop in their ears. They are afraid. The authorities, the white growers, and the local sheriffs have given no order to evacuate. The harvest season is on. The vegetable fields, the foundation of Florida's burgeoning winter agricultural empire, must be picked. This labor force, segregated and exploited, living in tin-roofed shacks with no rights and little pay, is considered expendable. As the winds begin to whip, rising from a moan to a shriek, it is too late to run. The eyewall of the Category 4 hurricane makes landfall. With apocalyptic force, it pushes the entire volume of Lake Okeechobee southward. The earthen dike dissolves in an instant. A wall of water, thick with mud, shattered timber, and the corpses of drowned cattle sweeps across the flat plains. It scours the land clean. Whole communities, places like Belle Glade, South Bay, and Pahokee are simply erased. The migrant camps are the first and the worst hit. People are swept away in the darkness, drowned or crushed by collapsing shanties. When the dawn breaks, a scene of almost biblical devastation is revealed. A vast, stinking inland sea stretches for miles, littered with over 2,500 corpses. The official death toll, heavily politicized and racist in its counting, will list 1,836, but the true number is likely over 3,000, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history. The stories that emerge are ones of profound neglect and stark heroism. While white survivors are taken by train to Miami for relief, Black survivors are forced at gunpoint to labor in the recovery, stacking and burning the swollen bodies of their own families to prevent disease. The state and federal response is slow, mired in the politics of the Jim Crow South. The disaster, however, forces a change. The public outcry leads the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to begin the monumental task of taming the Everglades with the Hoover Dike and a vast network of canals. This engineering marvel enables the explosive growth of South Florida's cities and agribusiness, but it is built on a mass grave, and its water management forever alters the fragile ecosystem. The modern Sunshine State rises, literally, on land reclaimed by the blood and forgotten sacrifice of its most vulnerable laborers. October 22, 1962, 2:17 p.m. On a stifling hot tarmac at Homestead Air Force Base, just south of Miami, the roar of B-52 Stratofortress engines is a constant, teeth-rattling drone. Inside a concrete block radar bunker, a young Air Force technician, his shirt soaked with sweat, stares unblinking at a green phosphor screen. His hand is poised over a red telephone. Across the Florida Straits, 90 miles away, Soviet technicians are uncrating nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba, bringing the world to the brink of annihilation. Florida is no longer a distant frontier or a sunny refuge. It is the forwardmost front line of the Cold War, ground zero for a potential war that would last 13 minutes. This palpable daily fear catalyzes a demographic revolution already simmering. Since Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959, a trickle of Cubans fleeing the communist regime had become a flood. Now, with missiles pointed at Miami, the exodus is framed as a patriotic duty. The U.S. government opens its arms, offering unprecedented support through the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966. But this isn't a story of passive reception. This is a story of fierce, determined rebirth. Cut to a storefront on Southwest 8th Street in Miami, 1965. The sign reads Versailles, named not for the French palace but for a beloved Havana social club. Inside, over tiny cups of sweet, strong cafecito, the air buzzes not with fear but with plans. Men in guayaberas, many of them former doctors, lawyers, and bankers in Cuba, are now plotting business ventures. They have traded their old lives for a fierce determination to rebuild. They pool resources in sociedades, informal credit unions. They take any job, buy any failing business, and work hours that defy the humid Florida heat. This energy doesn't just adapt to Miami, it seizes it and transforms it. By the 1970s, entire sectors of the city's economy, banking, construction, media, shipping, are dominated by Cuban exiles. They create a parallel, powerful society with its own political voice, fiercely anti-communist and unafraid to flex its growing electoral muscle. They turn Miami into the de facto capital of Latin America, a hemispheric crossroads of finance and culture. The Magic City is no longer just a tourist destination. It is a geopolitical and economic powerhouse born from a Cold War crisis. This success, however, creates new tensions. The rapid, transformative change fuels a backlash from some older residents, a cultural and linguistic clash that reshapes Florida's politics, setting the stage for the state's role as a bellwether in the nation's culture wars. The exile community's trauma and triumph become the engine for Florida's next, most complex identity. November 8, 2000, 2:45 a.m. The newsroom of Fox 35 in Orlando is a haze of cold coffee, crumpled pizza boxes, and electric tension. On the bank of monitors, every major network has just called the state of Florida, and thus the presidency of the United States, for Al Gore. But the young, sharp-eyed data analyst at the station, a man named Arnon Miskin, is staring at the raw numbers streaming in from the Florida Secretary of State's office. The vote margin is vanishingly thin, disappearing before his eyes as late precincts from the conservative Florida Panhandle, a region in the central time zone where polls closed an hour later, report in. "Something's wrong," he mutters. He picks up a direct line to the network's decision desk in New York. "You need to pull it back." At 2:52 a.m., Fox is the first to retract its call, plunging the nation into a constitutional crisis. Florida is, once again, the battleground where America's future is decided. For the next 36 days, the world's gaze fixes not on Miami's gleaming towers or Orlando's theme parks, but on the mundane mechanics of democracy in sleepy county election offices. Reporters from Tokyo to Berlin crowd into the drab Stephen P. Clark Government Center in Miami-Dade County, their cameras zooming in on exhausted civil servants holding punch card ballots up to the light, searching for the chads, the tiny rectangular fragments of paper that decide a presidency. Pregnant Chad, dimpled Chad, hanging Chad, these become the absurd, fraught lexicon of a national meltdown. It is a spectacle of surreal inertia, a glaring revelation of rusted, underfunded electoral machinery. The bitter, partisan legal battles rage all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which halts the recount in a 5-4 decision. The outcome grants George W. Bush the White House, but the true legacy of the 2000 election is the cementing of Florida's identity as the ultimate American swing state. It is a revelation of its new demographic colossus, a teeming, diverse, and deeply divided population where every vote, every ballot design, every election supervisor's decision holds world-altering consequence. In the aftermath, the state embarks on a furious partisan overhaul of its election laws and systems, a process that never truly ends. Each subsequent election becomes a war fought over voter access, district boundaries, and the rules of engagement itself. The Battle of the Chads proved that Florida was no longer a geographic or cultural outlier. It was the nation's pace car. Its tensions between North and South, old and new, native and immigrant, developer and environmentalist, were America's tensions, amplified by humidity and accelerated by growth. The state's history of booms and busts, of forgotten graves and engineered landscapes, of defiant resistors and ambitious builders, had all converged to create a place of relentless, contentious reinvention. The struggle for its soul, once fought with conquistadors' steel and Seminole musket, was now fought in courthouses, voting booths, and the very code of its election software. The past was not prologue. It was a relentless, shaping force.